morning. That text that Temesgen just read simply means that what has happened will happen again. And that pertains in general, but also specifically to those things which pertain to the great battle between good and evil, otherwise known as the great controversy between Christ and Satan. One time, several years ago, Mark and I were doing visitation, and we were visiting people, trying to encourage them to come to the evangelistic meetings. And this one individual would ask us questions. And when we would answer with texts from the Old Testament, he would laugh us to scorn. He put no stock at all in the Old Testament. But you know, there in Isaiah 8:20 it says, "To the law and to the testimony. If they speak not according to this, it is because there's no light in them." And of course, the law is the first 5 books of the Bible. Can you hear me okay? Okay. And the first 5 books of the Bible, and the testimony is the prophets, the testimony that God has given messages to that the prophets give and write down. And so, if it doesn't agree with that, there's no light in what someone says. And so God's will and God's truth have been established in the Old Testament. And anything else that happens is to be interpreted based on that scripture. Jesus himself referred many, many times to the Old Testament and to the prophets, prophets Elijah and Isaiah in particular. And so today we're going to talk about historical Elijah, and keep in mind Ecclesiastes 1:9. We're going to speak about the Bible concept of Elijah, and basically we're going to see that the Bible presents 3 distinct Elijahs. First is the Elijah of the Old Testament, and that's called the historical Elijah. The second one is the prophetic Elijah, or the Elijah of the New Testament. And the third one is the apocalyptic, which is simply the Elijah of Revelation, or in other words, the Elijah of the end time. So we're going to find out in these 3 Elijahs very many common elements. And they're very important when today to know these, so that when we study the prophetic Elijah and the end time Elijah, we will understand better. And there's 2 things we need to focus on today. Sequence of events in the story of Elijah, the Old Testament Elijah. And number 2, on the players or the characters involved in this story. And for example, first of all, there is a king or a political ruler in every single case, all 3 cases. Also, there is a harlot woman, and this harlot woman has instruments she uses to extend her influence, her apostate religion, and in today's case, they were the false prophets of Baal. Also involved are God's people. In fact, God's people are deceived by this 3-fold union of the king, the harlot, and the false prophets, which are the false prophets of Baal. And then we have, of course, Elijah himself, who rebukes this 3-fold alliance and causes God's people to come, hopefully, back to the straight and narrow way. Now, this religion, remember, we know we have King Ahab, king of Israel, and his wife is Jezebel, who is the queen. And this religion of Jezebel and Ahab is the religion, and the religion of the false prophet is known as the religion of Baal. And we see that Baal is the sun god. Now, first, let's begin with the three enemies of Elijah. And so I will give you these texts, and no need to turn to them. We're going to move rapidly. These enemies of Elijah, so we'll see that in 1 Kings 16. 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 30 and 31. And here we find a description of this alliance. And some call it a confederacy. And it's between the king, Ahab, and this harlot woman, Jezebel. It says there in starting verse 30, "Now Ahab, son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him, and it came to pass, as though it were a trivial thing, for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that he took as wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him." Now, who is Ethbaal? Ethbaal is the king of Sidon. Remember, Sidon is that country north of Tyrus, there on the Mediterranean, known for shipbuilding. And Ethbaal was the high priest of Baal. And his daughter, Jezebel, who married Ahab, she was the high priestess of Ashtaroth. And of course, you can pronounce it different ways in different countries, depending, it's written in the Bible different ways. Ashtaroth, Ishtar, they all come from the same root word as the word Easter. So they're all the same, and she was the goddess of fertility. So we find an alliance between King Ahab and the harlot woman. And what was their intention? Their intention was to lead Israel into practicing the false worship of Baal, who we notice is the sun god. Now, we need to recognize that the dangerous figure is not the political leader. It's not Ahab, the king. The dangerous figure in this whole story is actually Queen Jezebel. She's the one who manipulates things. She's the shadow ruler, which is behind the political ruler. Now, we see this, for example, in 1 Kings 21, 8 through 10, referring to, again, 1 Kings chapter 21, verses 8 through 10, referring to the death of Naboth. The Bible tells us that Ahab wanted Naboth's vineyard. And Ahab could see this vineyard right through his palace window. It was even within walking distance from his palace. And he wanted that. And Naboth would not sell it to him because it had been in his family for generations. So Ahab was moping around, and he was crying about this. He couldn't figure out a way to get the vineyard. And so Jezebel said, "I'll do it, I'll take care of it." And let's see what she did. How did she do it? In 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 8, it says, "Jezebel wrote letters in Ahab's name, in the king's name, sealed them with his seal, and sent the letters to the elders and the nobles who were living in Jerusalem." These were the high-ups. And she said this, "Seat Naboth with high honors among the people, and then look for 2 men, scoundrels, sons of Belial, to bear false witness against him. And so this sons of Belial in 2 Corinthians 6:15, this seems to be the proper name of Satan. So sons of Satan. And so witness against him, saying this, you have blasphemed God and the king, and then quickly take him out and stone him. So Naboth was being set up, was he not? And it took place. It took place. So notice again, this was not a decree from the king, but actually Jezebel who was writing the decree and sealing it with the king's seal. And it was all for the death of Naboth, who had done nothing wrong except refuse to sell out his vineyard to Naboth. Now, that little scenario, there's some typology there, if you just think about it. And so she was actually the shadow ruler, and she had enormous influence. So as we study the story of Elijah, we notice that Ahab the king had a very weak character and was easily manipulated because he was being manipulated by this strong-willed queen Jezebel. And we notice this here in 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 25. It says, but there was no one like Ahab who sold himself to do wickedness in the sight of the Lord. Why? It says here, because Jezebel, his wife, stirred him up. In other words, she is the one who is manipulating things. She's influencing the king so he will do her bidding. So you get the picture here, weak king, easily manipulated by a determined, apostate, harlot queen, strong-willed, who uses the king to accomplish her purposes. Now, what was the religion that Jezebel wanted to impose through the influence of the king? It was actually a syncretistic religion. That's a meshing of 2 religions. In other words, meshing the worship of the Lord and the worship of Baal. It wasn't purely Baal worship. It was actually a mixture of Jehovah worship and Baal worship. In fact, we notice this in 1 Kings 18, verse 21. This is when Elijah was there on Mount Carmel. We find these words. And Elijah came to all the people and said, how long will you falter between 2 opinions? The King James says, how long will you halt, which means limp. How long will you falter between 2 opinions? And it wasn't as if the people were determined on one side or the other. They weren't for one side or the other. They actually wanted 1 foot in one side and 1 foot on the other side. So Elijah here is saying, how long will you limp between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But the people answered him not a word. So in other words, we find this about this synchronistic religion where God's people are trying to, or at least claiming to, serve the Lord, and at the same time they were serving the sun god Baal. In Hosea, the book of Hosea chapter 2 verse 8, we find a description of the religion of Baal. You see, Baal was actually considered to be the energizer of creation, just as the sun's rays, they come and they strike the green plant and stimulates the plant to store and to make and store energy and to produce fruit. Well, that's what they thought Baal did. Now, here's what it says about Israel. There in Hosea chapter 2, verse 8. It says, "Nor did she," Israel, "not know that I gave her grain, new wine, and oil, and multiplied her silver and gold, which they prepared for Baal." So here we see that they didn't give credit to God, the Creator, for their increase, but instead gave it to Baal. Why? Well, because they had the misconception that Baal was the sun god who energized creation. So what Jezebel was imposing through her influence upon the king was actually the religion of the sun god. Now, this is corroborated in several Ellen White's writings. And we're not going to read them today because time marches on here, but the reference would be in Testimonies, Volume 3, page 282. Okay, let's notice a few more details about this woman, Jezebel, who is the dangerous figure in this scene. 1 Kings 18, verse 4. We find that Jezebel was a murderer of God's prophets in verse 4. So it says, "It was while Jezebel massacred the prophets of the Lord that Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hid them 50 to a cave and fed them with bread and gave them water to drink." Who was Obadiah? Obadiah was in charge of the king's palace, and he did not like Jezebel or her religion. So, folks, all these things we're talking about, they're real, they're true, but they're also typological, a type of what will happen in the future. Obadiah is no exception. There will be those in places where they know what's going on in responsible positions, and they will help God's people, and God will see to that. So Jezebel was a murderous woman who killed the servants of the Lord, and we find here after the Mount Carmel experience, she issued a death decree on Elijah. 1 Kings 19, verses 1 and 2. It says, "And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had executed the prophets of Baal." Notice in verse 2 she says to Elijah by letter, "So let the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." In other words, Jezebel gave out a death decree against Elijah. But we need to notice something, that God shielded the life of Elijah and protected him from the death decree, and eventually Elijah was translated to heaven. Let's notice three other characteristics of this harlot woman who influenced the king. You know, she united with the secular power or the civil government. 2 Kings 9, verse 22, it says there, "Now it happened when Joram saw Jehu that he said, 'Is it peace, Jehu?' He answered, 'What peace? As long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many.'" Wow. Here this woman is called mother. She's involved in the occult and involved in harlotry or whoredoms. So we need to remember these terms in this scenario concerning the stories of the three Elijahs. So when we go to the other two at a later date. Now, 1 Kings 18, verse 19, there's another group that Jezebel uses to accomplish her purposes, and these are known as the false prophets of Baal. It says in verse 19, this is Elijah when he's on Mount Carmel. He says, "Now gather all Israel to me on Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah." And now this is important here, who eat at Jezebel's table. So who fed the false prophets? Jezebel. Who paid them? Jezebel. And so these false prophets extended the religion of Baal throughout the entire kingdom according to the will of Jezebel. And of course, the threefold alliance actually had Israel, God's people, deceived. In 1 Kings, moving on here, 1 Kings 21, verse 22, God says, speaking to Ahab, he says, "I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha, the son of Ahijah, for the provocation where you have provoked me to anger and made Israel to sin." Well, you can't make anybody sin, but you can lead them that direction. And concerning Jezebel, in verse 23, it says, "The dogs shall eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel." So what is God telling here to Ahab? He's saying, your genealogy will end. You're done. The same thing for Jezebel. So the king, the civil government, the harlot woman, and the false prophets led Israel to sin. And they were doing this all the time while looking for a way to kill Elijah. And in 1 Kings 19, verse 10, Elijah, I think, is feeling a bit sorry for himself, but he says this, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts." Notice this, "For the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." So did you notice who was it that was wanting to take Elijah's life? Who actually was persecuting the prophets of the Lord? True, the king, Jezebel, the false prophets, but clearly here it says that it was the children of Israel who forsook the covenant and actually did this work. So you see, this threefold alliance is acting upon the congregation to persecute Elijah through their influence throughout the kingdom. The congregation of the Lord, those who profess to follow God. So it's important also to note that Elijah is sent to God's people, not to the unchurched, not to the pagans. The Elijah message is sent to those who profess to serve the true God. In other words, not to the secular minded who profess no God or profess no religion. Also, let's notice that Elijah did not bring any new religion into Israel, no new teachings. His purpose was to bring them back to the truth, to the foundations, to the worship of the true God. In Malachi chapter 4, verse 5 and 6, it says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great dreadful day of the Lord." That's the second coming of Christ. "And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse." So there's going to be a reconciliation between generations, it says. What generations? Well, it would be any generation who spiritually hears this message, and they will be reconciled with the generation of the founders of Israel. Who were the founders of Israel? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Many times in the Old Testament, God says, "I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And so, in reality, what's taking place here is there will be a reconciliation between the generations and the true Creator God. So Elijah is not sent to the Babylonians, the Philistines, or the Egyptians, but to those who profess to be God's people, who are apparently practicing false religion. They're trampling on the commandments of God. They're worshiping the sun god Baal. And so it says, he will turn many of the children of Israel back to the Lord their God. In Matthew 17, verse 11, concerning the role of Elijah, Jesus answered and said, "Indeed, Elijah is coming first, and he will restore all things." In other words, he'll bring the people back to the way it was. And we see that Elijah is the restorer, restoring things back to the true God. So the role of Elijah is to speak to God's people who are worshiping the sun god and rebuke the threefold alliance, so the people will come back to God, the God that they had once believed in, and they would come back to embrace the commandments that they have forsaken. Now, in Scripture, it's impossible to talk about worship without talking about the Creator, because we worship God because He is the Creator. In Psalms 95, verse 6, it says, "O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord, our," what? Our Maker. Now, you can't talk about God, the Maker, our Creator, without talking about the Sabbath, because the Sabbath is the sign of the Creator. If Israel had kept the Sabbath, they would never have worshiped Baal. How could they attribute creative power to Baal if they had kept the Sabbath? Because the Sabbath indicated that there was only one true Creator God, Creator of the heavens and the earth. There in Revelation 14, verse 6 and 7, notice how the idea of the Creator and worship are linked together with the Sabbath, because the Sabbath is mentioned at the conclusion of creation week, there in Genesis chapter 2. So in Revelation 14, verse 6, "I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven," and so forth. But we want to underline this: "And worship Him who made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of water." And by the way, that's a reference to the fourth commandment of God's holy law. where we're told to worship the Creator on the seventh day. So there's a clear link between the worship of the Creator and the Sabbath. It becomes very obvious that Israel was not keeping the Sabbath, or else they would not have been worshiping the sun god. Notice again here in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 18. Elijah is meeting with King Ahab, and of course Ahab accused him. He says, "Are you the one that's troubling Israel?" Elijah says, "I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, in that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and you have followed the Baals." Now, what commandments of God had they forsaken? How about the first one? No other gods, thou shalt have no other gods other than me. And the other commandment involved is the commandment of fornication or adultery. Elijah here is actually rebuking the adulterous relationship between Ahab and Jezebel. You see, she, as the high priestess of Ashtoreth, the goddess of fertility, was promoting licentious worship behavior, but also promoting the worship of the false god Baal, who we know is the sun god. So she was not only a physical harlot, but a spiritual harlot. Now, how do we explain this a little bit better? Who is, in the New Testament, who is the bridegroom? Jesus is the bridegroom. Who is the bride? The church. And technically, it's the New Jerusalem, but New Jerusalem contains all of those who are saved. Now, if this bride seeks another lover and finds one or more, what is she called? Adulteress? Okay. And so that would explain that concept. It's spiritual adultery. Now, this Elijah message that Elijah gave, "Choose this day whom you will serve," went over like a lead balloon for the most part. And because the message was rejected, God closed up the heavens so it couldn't rain. And the resulting famine was so bad that it reached Ahab's palace. And Elijah, who do you suppose was blamed for this? Elijah was blamed for this calamity. Ahab said, "You are the troubler of Israel. You know, if you had accepted our religion, this would not have happened. The calamities would cease." And Jezebel, she refused to believe that she had any part in this, but she knew that the gods were angry, and they were withholding rain. And so she put out a death decree on Elijah, and thinking that get rid of Elijah, then there would be rain. But you know what? They couldn't find him. They couldn't find Elijah. And this is a striking typological story that will be fulfilled in the end time. And remember, God had said that Ahab would be cut off from the earth. The dogs would eat up all who belonged to Ahab. And concerning Jezebel, God said dogs would eat her body at the wall of Jezreel. It's exactly what happened. And the royal couple came to an end. There's one other point. There was a delay between the death decree and Elijah's translation. In 1 Kings 18, verses 43 and 44, it said, "And Elijah went up to the top of Mount Carmel, Then he bowed down on the ground, put his face between his knees, and said to his servant, "Go up now, look toward the sea." So he went up and looked and said, "There's nothing." And 7 times he said, "Go again." And the 7th time he says, "There's a cloud smaller than a man's hand rising out of the sea." So Elijah said, "Well, go to Ahab now and say, 'Get your chariot ready and go down before the rain stops you.'" That small cloud signaled that rain was coming, but it also signaled and indicated that Elijah was going to be translated. Let's look at the Bible account of the translation of Elijah. 2 Kings chapter 2. That's 2 Kings chapter 2, 11 and 12. And let's recap here. This was after Elijah went through, I should say, the tribulation. After he faced the Triple Alliance. After he presented the message with boldness. And after the fire came down from heaven. And after Jezebel, Ahab, and the prophets of Baal have perished. And here we have the culmination of the story of Elijah in 2 Kings 2, 11 and 12. He, in short, is translated to heaven. It says, as Elijah and Elisha were walking and talking, suddenly a chariot of fire with horses of fire came down and separated the two of them. And then Elijah went up in a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha witnessed it. Okay, so it's not over yet, because we read again in Malachi 4, verses 5 and 6. Again says that before the great and terrible day of the Lord, God will once again, send Elijah. Now, is this Elijah in person who will descend upon earth and give a message? It's not. It's those who will give the Elijah message. What is the Elijah message? Well, it's the 3 angels' message of Revelation 14, 6 through 12, because it refers people back to the Creator, and it exposes the threefold alliance that draw people away from the Creator and to the created. Who only has this message? Who is it? It is our denomination, our church denomination. Will we, in this church, continue with boldness to give out the 3 angels' messages? Thank you.